Right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start our second session of the day, and if it's half as good as the morning session was, it would be inspiring. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of the Federation of Local Studies and the Federation of Local History Societies, both of this morning's speakers, because I thought they were really great. And I've got it all on video, so for a small fee, perhaps I won't show it. I won't show it, somebody said. Well, can I say welcome to Dr. Peter Collins, who's our first speaker of the day. Peter is a senior lecturer in history at St Mary's University College in Belfast. Peter teaches Irish and British history mid-19th to early 20th century. He also taught 20th century United States history for 10 years. He has published widely, including publishing several books on aspects of Irish history. He has a special interest in Irish labour history, writing and lecturing on how and why Irish labour was squeezed out politically during the period from 1912 to 1922. He is also a founder member of History Ireland magazine and a member of its editorial board. He also organises summer schools for a wide range of American universities and has done for quite a few years. Interestingly, Peter has researched and lectured widely on Belfast murals, that rich artistic feature of the city. There are hundreds of them, and not all of them political by any means. They are in fact themselves a whole subject in themselves, and they are a major tourist attraction. Peter's going to talk to us about the impact of the war and its aftermath had on the working class in the north of Ireland. Peter.
Well, I think if we have a bit of light on this subject, really, I can't believe now. While we're that's better. Turn it down a wee bit if you want, if it affects the lighting. Pat, thank you very much. Same growth as it had, in Belfast that is, we've achieved the same growth it had in other UK cities like Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds and so on, but it never did. So let's see why that happened. Now the conference is also looking at the impact of war and rebellion on the ordinary people. It's very difficult actually to rustle up all these ordinary people because they haven't usually left their sort of papers or any information about themselves. Indeed, even politicians like Joe Devlin, who burned his papers, are always very diffident about what they've been up to, shall we say, and some with good reason, you could say as well. But anyway, what I have done here is I've put up an organisational structure of the kind of organisations that I'll be talking about, so quickly memorise those. Alright. Oops. Now, I'm going to talk about the dramatis personae, as they say, the people who had influence in the labour movement and ultimately who failed to deliver a fully formed, shall we say, party. Now the first one is William Walker. Walker, who was a joiner in Holland and Wolf Shipyard, was an evangelical Protestant. He was what we call a labour unionist, a municipal socialist. Some people call that gas and water socialism, very moderate form of socialism. But he believed that the British Empire was a progressive body which would lead to proletarian internationalism. He wanted Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom, and he was opposed to any form of home rule or nationalism. He also wanted British Labour Party, which had started in 1900, to organise throughout Ireland. Now this photograph was taken in 1923, but it's the one we all remember, because Jim Larkin, this is taken after he just come back from America, was born in Liverpool to parents from Armagh. And he came to Belfast in 1907 in order to organise the dockers there, and he got drawn into the dockers and carter strike, and that was a kind of a pre-run of what happened in Dublin in 1913, unfortunately with the same outcomes. But anyway, he left behind a labour force in the docks that was divided along political and religious lines. So when he went to Dublin in 1909, he formed the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which is really plays a big part in events at this particular time. Now, this is James Connolly, all familiar with that effigy, but do you know this? This is a recently erected statue of James Connolly on the Falls Road, just a few hundred yards from where he lived, in Glenolina Terrace, the top of the Donegal Road. I attended that unveiling, and they had his grandson speaking there. So it was a very good event, and it brought back to all of us the fact that Connolly played a big part in Belfast history during the time he was there, from 1910 to 1914. Now, he became a contentious and divisive figure during his years in the city. There was a lot of political notoriety, and he was associated with nationalism, as we'll see. But he also fell out with other trade unionists, most notably Mary Galway. Mary Galway, who organised the Irish Textile Operatives Society. He was accused by her of poaching her members, but actually they were ununionised women that he set up a separate union for. But anyway, they didn't seem to like him all that much in Belfast. They thought he was a kind of a carpetbagger who was arrogant and who was going to tell us what to do. But anyway, he wanted to unite the Independent Labour Party, which was Walker's organisation. He had 5 branches in Belfast, and form with the Socialist Party of Ireland, which he was a member of. He wanted to form an Independent Labour Party of Ireland, and that would lead ultimately to an Irish Labour Party. Now, Walker and Connolly had a kind of a controversy between themselves about socialist unity and about nationalism, which was published in the Glasgow socialist paper Forward. So he, by the first year he was in Belfast, had achieved a great deal of notoriety and commentary on him by the unionist press, and not only the unionist press, but also by the Devlinite Irish News. Connolly fell foul, sometimes deliberately, of both unionists and nationalists, particularly the AOH that Devlin controlled. Now, 2 of his lieutenants or acolytes, whatever you want to call, are probably less well known as Connolly, although Thomas Johnson was the leader of the Labour Party in the South, the first leader of Labour in Dáil Éireann. But before we get to that situation, he came to Belfast from Liverpool, like Larkin. He was a veterinary salesman, and he was a Protestant, because you have to mention these things because it usually denotes one particular political allegiance or other. Less well known is David Robb Campbell. Oops. Now, I hope you can see that clearly. There are no extant photographs of Campbell on his own. I interviewed his son many years ago, and he had all these glorious photographs in a big box. And in those days, and these days, you just take out your smartphone and go, but we didn't have smartphones in the 80s. Anyway, he's second from the left, seated. Anyway, that's at the Irish Trade Union Congress. Both Johnson and Campbell were bigwigs, you could say, in the Belfast Trades Council, and later in the Irish Trade Union Council. Now, Connolly couldn't have chosen a worse time to go to Belfast if you're an advanced socialist and nationalist, because as you know, from 1912, Home Rule became a very raw issue, particularly in the city of Belfast. There was an expectation that Home Rule would be introduced in 1914. So what was Connolly's attitude to it? Well, he was lukewarm, but would accept it as a poor substitute for complete independence, a halfway house maybe. He was identified by his unionist opponents as a supporter of Home Rule. Now the Belfast Trades Council, in which all of these people took part, you see, the Trades Council was a kind of a parliament of labour, as some people have called it, where you went once a month and you discussed union matters, trade union matters, but also politics of the day, and aspire to gain political control of the city council, or the corporation as it was called then. Now, Walker, who's also very much involved with the Trades Council, was very much against Home Rule, as I said. So here's one of the reasons why. If you look at that, you can see this is the front of the City Hall. I have noticed recently being in the front of the City Hall, you can see there it says "To Let." You know, there are a lot of stores or shops there that have got signs like that on it. But this is, of course, a postcard opposing Home Rule, which you had for all of the towns in the north. You had Dungannon and Portadown and so on. But this one, I think, is particularly poignant because, as you can see, there are pigs and sheep grazing and so on. Obviously, the statue of King Redmond and Dillon, and there's Skin the Goat, James Fitzharris. Anybody know who he was? Well, yeah, he was one of the Invincibles. Yeah. So you can see there's a commentary here by unionists that our industry and our commerce will be destroyed if we have Home Rule. So there's another. Oops. Here's another one. This is the Albert Memorial Clock to give it its full title. And as you can see, not only is it being sort of pulled down, but also it's a bit like, you might remember Saddam was overthrown. Well, what you can see here is another statue of Redmond, but there's the Protestant Immigration Bureau. So, and of course, naturally, and Myrtle touched on this morning, the vast majority of Protestants here in the north signed a covenant, although there was a less violent element in the ladies' covenant, right? Okay, because they weren't supposed to either vote or take part in violence. Anyway, the Home Rule crisis got worse because people decided that they would have to resist it. Now, as far as Labour was concerned, one really bad thing happened in the summer of 1912. And that was when a group of Hibernian bandsmen attacked a Protestant Sunday school excursion in Castle Dawson, and this led to the expulsion of Catholics and Protestant trade union activists. Now, among those expelled was my paternal grandfather, a man who had come from Dundalk, no less a place, to work in the shipyard. He was a carpenter and joiner and French polisher. So he was expelled. He had 7 children, and he didn't work really until the First World War started. More of that later. Now, Campbell, who we mentioned earlier on, tried very hard to get the workers reinstated, but to no real avail. So these people were what had happened was that this was just an excuse, really, to get rid of Catholic workers. It wasn't the employers that did that. It was, Dave, it wasn't most of the workforce. It was a kind of a gang of sort of extremists that did that. Right. Now, as we see here, the Covenant, the vast majority of people in Belfast who were in organised trade unions signed a covenant. Belfast trade unions were organised along different lines. For example, the skilled workers in the shipyards and engineering works were in the British-based unions. Some people went to the Trades Council, as we have said earlier on, but most Protestant workers had nothing to do with the Trades Council, and this would become even more so as Connolly and others got involved in, oops, it's a finger light touch here, this one, it's like a hard trigger. Anyway, so in 1913 we had the Dublin lockout. Now the Dublin lockout was led, as you know, by James Larkin, but Connolly came down from Belfast to help out, and he was arrested. He was released shortly afterwards and came back to Belfast. Now at the Great Northern Railway Station, as he got off the train, there was a large mob singing party songs. Party songs sound very innocent, don't they? Anyway, and firing revolvers, so he had to be spirited away. So you can see what the loyalist people of Belfast thought of Connolly. Now, he also organised a trade union, his trade union, ITGW, excursion to Port Rush, and when they came back after that, this is later in the summer, the same kind of welcome awaited them. Okay. Now, there's the Irish Citizen Army. Now, the Irish Citizen Army, as you know, was set up originally as by the ITGW to sort of defend people who were locked out against the Dublin Metropolitan Police. That's a contentious photograph because some people think that Jack White's in it, but I'm told reliably that he isn't. But he is there. Captain Jack White was an associate of Connolly, originally from Brushane, which is near Ballymena, son of Field Marshal Sir George White, hero of Ladysmith. He was also a British Army officer, but somewhere along the road he took a different turn, and he became very much an advanced socialist. He ultimately went to Spain and married a Spaniard, but he also joined the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War. So, very unusual kind of person from that background, that sort of big house Protestant background in the north of Ireland. One of the things about him, though, that is endearing is that he was one of the few men who wheeled his child around in public in a pram, sort of mitigated by the fact that he went to the pub and left the pram outside. Now, one of the things about the Home Rule Bill as it was passing through its second reading was that there was so much opposition to it in Ulster in particular, but also right across the United Kingdom, that it was decided to put in an amendment to it, which they called in those days the exclusion of Ulster, or we call it partition. Now, Connolly, of course, got in on the act and said that partition would usher in a carnival of reaction north and south, and that's one of the sayings of Connolly that's often repeated. Another saying about partition and exclusion by a priest, Father Philip O'Doherty, was, "It would deliver us," that's the nationalist community, "into the hands of our unsleeping, unrelenting, hereditary enemies." So people were taking sides very much on partition. So anyway, the majority of Protestant workers in Belfast were in favour of exclusion. You see, the thing is, these debates were going on in the Trades Council, and Connolly and Campbell and Johnson were opposed more and more by the other members of that. Now, another divisive issue came with the coming of war. Oops, I'll just leave it there. Right. Now, before the war, socialists internationally said that they would not take part in a war because it was a war of the elites and that working class would suffer as a result. But once war actually did start, in most countries, the working class and their political organisations joined with the government in their war aims. Of course, Connolly and Larkin and other nationalists in the Labour movement persuaded the Irish Trade Union Congress to oppose the war. So that didn't endear them again to the people in the north of Ireland, the workers that they claimed to represent, because in actual fact most of them supported the war. Right now, one of those that I want to mention was this thing is out of sync. Right? Was I interviewed George McBride 2 years before he died. What? You? I didn't interview, it wasn't me. Now, Myrtle mentioned Winnie Carney, who was his wife, and there you can see a kind of a, not your wife. I don't know. There you can see George and Winnie superimposed on their marriage certificate. They were married in 1928 in North Wales in a registry office, and it's kind of a Romeo and Juliet story, isn't it? Winnie Carney, as we've already heard, was the typist with a Webley revolver, that's how she's known, and she was Connolly's union secretary. And when, as Myrtle said, 1916 started, she went down and was in the GPO. And I don't know if you saw the Rebellion series on RTE. Did you like it? One of the highlights of it was when Connolly said, "Miss Carney, take this dispatch and type it up," or something like that, you know. Ridiculous. Anyway, the two of these actually, there you are. Can you read it? There you are. You didn't know it's waiting for you in Bangor. The George McBride that I'm talking about, not you. For a long time, neither of them. This is a kind of, I suppose you could say it's kind of like a very black period in our history, but they got married and neither of their families approved of it. How unusual, but anyway. So Winnie didn't have a headstone in Milltown Cemetery, and then later on it was put there by the National Graves Association. But a number of people in the trade union movement this year installed this headstone for George in the cemetery in Bangor. So I think that's a nice way to tie things up about it. But anyway, I interviewed George 2 years before he died. He died in 1988, as you can see. He was an apprentice fitter in Mackey's, a member of the UVF, and later of the 36th Ulster Division. And he actually fought at the Battle of the Somme. You know, we're commemorating both it and the Easter Rising. I asked him what was the attitude of his mates to the war, that's the way I put it. And he said, not all the UVF joined up, but most of us younger ones did. For us, there was a spirit of adventure, a sense of getting away from the boredom, the poverty and the lack of opportunity of our life in Belfast. When we got to Ballykindler camp for training, we felt that not only were we doing our duty, we were fortunate in doing something that would have otherwise been out of the grasp of ordinary Belfast lads. Very few Protestants in Belfast would have opposed the war. If they did, they knew to keep quiet about it. Okay, so that was, you know, that's an attitude that most working class people would have. Just another thing he told me, he was from the Shankill Road, yet he never met a Catholic until he was taken prisoner of war and sent to the Black Forest to do some wood felling as a POW. It wasn't you, sure it wasn't? Okay, well, we'll stop that link. Right. Now, the Southern Irish Trade Union Congress leaders were opposed to the war, largely under the influence of the Larkin and Connolly. Connolly was still in Belfast when the war broke out, and despite the pro-war feeling in the city, he opposed the war. He said, "I know of no foreign enemy in this country except the British government. Should a German army land in Ireland tomorrow, we should be perfectly justified in joining it, if by so doing we could rid this country once and for all from its connection with the brigand empire that drags us unwillingly to war." And then he says, "Should the working class of Europe, rather than slaughter each other for the benefit of kings and financiers, proceed tomorrow and then he goes into what they should do, a revolution. It would be justified in following such a glorious example than contributing our aid to the vulture classes that rule and rob the world." Needless to say, this was reported in various newspapers, making him even more popular and dividing the labour movement that he was hoping to unite. Worse was the fact that he held anti-war meetings in Upper Library Street, which is just off the centre of the city, just below the Shankill Road, and of course that attracted a lot of young unionists, so you can imagine what that was going. Ultimately, his lieutenants, Campbell and O'Brien, voted against holding these meetings again, and he was very annoyed about it. The interruptions of about a dozen young orange hooligans were magnified into an awful danger. Right. So, now, moving on swiftly to 1914, Jim Larkin went to America because partly of the fact that the lockout had taken an awful lot out of him, but also he hoped to expand his horizon and as a speaker and so on in America and get involved with the American labour movement. Connolly took over the headquarters of the union, even though he wasn't Larkin's initial choice. While he was in Dublin, obviously he got drawn into the conspiracy that the revived IRB, like Clark and McDermott, were organising. He actually threatened to use the ICA if the IRB weren't going to have a rising. He would have a rising, so they had to bring him into the conspiracy. Okay, so the point about all of this was that Connolly was showing what everybody thought of him. The point is, Connolly was clearly an advanced nationalist as well as a socialist. So the divisions in the Northern Trade Union movement and labour movement were very much widened by the fact of Connolly's notoriety as far as the Protestant working class was concerned. So it was a very difficult task that the President of the Irish Trade Union Congress in August 1916, who was our friend Johnson, had to make a speech in which he kept both loyalists and nationalists together. So I'm going to quote from what he said. He paid tribute to Connolly and two other labour men, O'Carroll and Mackin, who lost their lives in the Rising. As a trade union movement, we are of varied minds in matters of history and political development, and this is consequently not the place to enter into the discussion of the right or folly of the revolt. But this we may say, that amongst those rebels who have been associated with us in the past, i.e. Connolly, who have led and inspired some of us with their love of the country and their class, resolved to act as they did with no selfish thought, but purely with a passion for freedom and a hatred of oppression. And then he goes on, because this is when the Battle of the Somme is raging, to talk of those many others who have laid down their lives in another field, also for what they believe to be the cause of liberty and democracy and love of their country. So, in that spirit, I ask all present, whatever their views may be in regard to the war or rebellion, to rise for a moment in token of respect
for all our comrades who have been brave enough to give their lives for the cause they believed in. Now, the American historian Arthur Mitchell states that the refusal of the Johnson-led Congress to accept any responsibility for the rebellion indicates that Johnson and the other leaders planned to build up a Labour Party that would stress social and economic issues on which there was no disagreement. You see, their experience, Johnson and Campbell in Belfast, led them to believe that if you went full throttle for some kind of independence, that you would break the whole Labour movement up. So they were wanting to move much more slowly. One thing that they did do, and Campbell's son told me this, and he told me never to broadcast this, but you know. Anyway, it's a long, long time ago he told me. He said, when martial law was declared in Dublin, and the trade unions were closed down, and a lot of leaders were being arrested even though they had no part in the rising, Campbell and Johnson and their wives went down to the bank in Dublin, got out all the money, hid it on their persons, and went to Blackpool. You know, so there you are, there's a breaking news. Right. Now, the whole point about, yes, well, it wasn't for them. Anyway, the whole point about what I'm showing you is a kind of a litany of leading towards events and responses to those events leading towards a split in the Labour movement and a squeezing out, as I was saying earlier on, of any potential Labour political sort of emergence. Now, Tom Johnson became Secretary of the National Anti-Conscription Movement when, in March 1918, the government decided that it would introduce conscription to Ireland, which it hadn't done when it was introduced in 1915 in the rest of the UK. And the reason they hadn't done that was that it would provoke a rebellion in Ireland, and even moderate nationalists and the Catholic Church wouldn't accept it. Why were they doing this? Well, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of 1918, the Russian front ceased, and 1 million men were brought to the Western Front, and Ludendorff sent them, and they gained ground for a while on the Western Front. So at that stage, the government thought, well, we need to have more soldiers from Ireland, so we'll introduce that. Now, as far as Johnson and Campbell were concerned, this is something that oh dear, I've missed. Oh, well, there's the Battle of the Somme, famous.
That was painted by my great-great-uncle.
Well,
who married an Ulster woman.
Who was the
James
painter?
Princess Beadle.
Yeah, that's right. And that's in the City Hall.
Yeah, his father was a general. He wanted to go into the army, but he had a club foot, so he did military painting.
Right.
And I presume because his wife came from Northern Ireland, that's why he painted it.
Well, you learn something every day, you know, if not from the lecturer or from the audience. What I was going to show you was, I had hoped to, there was an anti-conscription bill that was sent around at a meeting at the Custom House Steps, which is where we have a lot of, we used to have a lot of speeches, kind of a Hyde Park corner of Belfast, where they held an anti-conscription meeting, and they said, we'll assemble on Tuesday at the City Hall and try to persuade the Lord Mayor and others to go against conscription, which was a big ask, believe me. So, anyway, what happened was they did turn up at the City Hall in quite a few numbers, but people were waiting for them because the previous meeting and that bill that I can't show you, handbill, were already in the press, and a hot reception for Johnson and Campbell and others from shipyard workers. Shipyard workers seem to be like a behemoth that erupts at any given time. If they feel that the union is threatened, and I'm not talking about the trade union. So the point is, that a lorry attacked the platform which was erected in front of the City Hall, on which Johnson and Campbell and others were standing. Johnson was hit with a missile, and the whole thing dispersed in panic. The Irish News reported that senior Ulster Unionist Council members stood on Robinson Cleaver's balcony looking on quite happily. There were riots that night. So again, what we're saying is conscription was something that Johnson and Campbell and other Labour leaders were involved in. There was a anti-conscription committee called the Mansion House Committee. Johnson became secretary there, and it was a paid job because he was told by his employer that if he didn't give up his attachment to anti-conscription work, he could leave, and that's what he did do. So that was his entree to Dublin, and ultimately, as I said earlier on, he became the head of the Irish Labour Party. The Irish Labour Party, I forgot to say, was founded in 1912, largely through the efforts of Larkin and Connolly in particular, and the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Right. Now, the Northern Whig was a unionist newspaper, and it reported on what the Mansion House Committee was doing. That is, at the end of April 1918, they would have a general strike in the whole of Ireland. But unfortunately for them, in the northeast, it didn't take place, naturally enough, because the vast majority of workers were unionist. It reported Belfast and Ulster unaffected, work and business as usual. And it says, the great majority of Belfast labour, organised and unorganised, have no sympathy for the anti-conscription sentiment and completely disregarded it. Okay, right. Now, in 1918 we had a general election, and it looked like Labour, which had been growing because of the growth of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and so on, might win seats, particularly in Dublin. But largely due to Johnson, they decided to give Sinn Féin a clear run in the election. Now, of course, that was in the south, but the reaction to it in Belfast was you're bowing down to Sinn Féin. Now, there had been the establishment of a separate Belfast Labour Party in 1917, and it contested the 4 city seats. And there you can see Victoria was mentioned this morning, 395 for Winifred Carney. And the other seats, there was another organisation called the Ulster Unionist Labour Association. I'm going to break off here now because I didn't tell you I'm under the influence of antibiotics, so I'll be back in a second. Excuse me.
Okay, folks, we'll be back in a second.
Yeah.
I'm easy now, reason why you don't. Peter's coming back anyway.
This doesn't often happen, of course. I do apologise, but the side effects of that antibiotic, you now know. Anyway, sorry about that. Now, this general election, as you can see, the Labour and indeed Sinn Féin in Belfast didn't do very well. Just to tell you that the Ulster Unionist Labour Association was set up deliberately to wean away any potential workers from the Labour movement. Politically, that is. When you think of a Labour Association with Edward Carson as president and the linen manufacturer J.M. Andrews as chairman, well, you have to think, what's the connection? But anyway, the connection was put in a letter from Dawson Bates to Carson. The working people in Belfast have felt for a considerable time past that means should be placed at their disposal whereby domestic matters should be discussed by them under unionist auspices. The absence of such means, as I have indicated, frequently leads the younger members of the working class to socialist, i.e. extreme organisations where they are educated in views very different to those held by our body. Now, so that was a big defeat for Labour. Now, in 1920, though, they recovered with the Belfast Corporation elections. The reason for that was that there was increased industrial militancy due to the 44-hour Federation of Engineering and Shipbuilding strike. They wanted 44 hours, they didn't get it. Even though Belfast, unlike Clydeside during the First World War, had worked, with the government. There was no shop stewards movement that had strikes because there was an industrial truce throughout the rest of the UK, outside of Red Clydeside, as they called it. Anyway, Labour won 13 out of 60 council seats, and they elected D.R. Campbell as their leader. Now, this, of course, brings us to the fact that 1920 was a very bad time for to be either, I suppose, an advanced nationalist or indeed to be a trade union leader. And there was what we call a pogrom on, and something like 480 people were killed, and that's actually more than was happening in Germany during the various revolutions in that year, 1920 to 1922, those figures are. Now, Labour in the North was affected by the war that was going on in the South. When the Railway Workers' Union refused to carry British Army and weapons. In 1920 they refused to bring home the coffin of Colonel Smith, a Banbridge man who was murdered in Munster. Reaction to this was very swift, and after an inflammatory speech by Carson at the field at Finnehy on the 12th of July, he said, "These men," referring to the Labour, "who come forward posing as the friends of Labour, care no more about Labour than does the man in the moon. Their real object and the real insidious nature of their propaganda is that they mislead and bring about disunity among our own people. And in the end, before we know where we are, we may find ourselves in the same bondage and slavery as the rest of Ireland." Now, this led to a second expulsion of Catholics and so-called rotten frauds. That was a nickname for trade union activists and socialists. So Campbell decided to take action. He put forward a motion in the corporation, and it wanted the corporation to do something to have these people who were expelled, 7,000 of them actually, including my paternal grandfather again. And unfortunately, he phoned the Lord Mayor and said, things are so bad at the moment, can we postpone that motion? The Lord Mayor said, okay, but then went ahead and had the meeting. So Campbell didn't turn up, nor did any of the Labour councillors. Now there was a large crowd of shipyard workers there again in the public gallery, which was festooned with loyalist flags and signs. This turned the whole proceedings into mob rule rather than a democratic forum, with the mob interrupting the debates and intimidating their opponents. Labour was conspicuous by its absence. Now, there was a unionist amendment put forward by Councillor Twaddell. You may know that from Twaddell Avenue of the present, so past meets the present. Unfortunately, Twaddell, later who was West Belfast MP, was assassinated by the IRA in 1922. Twaddell said that the City Council had no right to dictate to the employers and no action should be taken. Okay, and let me see. If you look at, you see the guy second from the left of the photograph, that's a guy called Alex Boyd, who was Larkin's lieutenant in 1907 strike. He had by now become a loyalist. Anyway, he also put forward quite a forthright statement. He said that the attacks had been made on workers and expelled workers because they were Sinn Féiners, not because they were Catholics. Many of the expelled were, he claimed, Protestants with Sinn Féin sympathies. When Unionists went to war, their places had been filled with slackers from other parts of Ireland, so that was the attitude. Anyway, in the absence of Labour, Sinn Féin, who were joint signatories, rose to put the motion. The person who rose to put the motion was Dennis McCullough, former chief of the IRB, and also the man who had attempted to join the Easter Rising by bringing people from Belfast to Coal Island. Then they were supposed to go down to Skidden, but never came off. But anyway, pistols were drawn, revolvers were fired into the air, missiles were thrown. He was spat upon from the gallery and his words lost in the rumpus. The town clerk had to get unionist councillors to restore order, lest the gallery collapse under the strain. Needless to say, the amendment, which was put by the unionists, was passed and the motion defeated. The Northern Whig stated that councillors and workers in the gallery sang the national anthem in stentorian fashion. So this must have gratified very little the Sinn Féiners who stuck to their guns and will please still less the Labour Socialists who ran away. Right, so that's particularly, it illustrates that if you're trying to have an advanced Labour movement in a city like Belfast, you've got on the one side nationalists, on the other side you've got unionists, and to break through in that there was very, very difficult. Anyway, even worse were in 1921 elections to the new Northern Ireland Parliament. Three of the candidates, Baird and Hannah and Harry Midgley, who at that time was a Connollyite, who would later move, shall we say, after the Spanish Civil War had started. He was a representative of Dock Ward, and he spoke in favour of the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, and the Catholic Church attacked him. So he seems to have moved as a result of that, ultimately to become a unionist Minister of Education, and even more so a director of Linfield Football Club. Now, these three had booked the Ulster Hall for an election meeting. However, the hall was filled by 4,000 shipyard workers who had marched there after work. The Labour candidates hid in the dressing room while a triumphant loyalist meeting was held in place. This physical rout became an electoral one with only 1,877 combined votes for the three Labour anti-partitionist candidates. Labour was being squeezed out in the trauma attending the birth of the Northern State. Now, there's a lot I've had to leave out there because, maybe some of you will have questions to ask later. Thank you very much.